Welcome to a story that begins not with a crown or a confession, but with a heartbeat, one so soft, yet so profound, that even the silence learned to listen. This is not the tale of a prince who conquered lands, but of a poet who surrendered to love. He loved her quietly, but the world heard his heart. These words are not mere poetry, they are the truth of Sheikh Hamdan, the man who spoke through verses when his lips could not, the man who hid eternity in a whisper. His promise was never written, yet it echoed through time, carrying the weight of a love too sacred for the world to touch. When he first saw her, time did not stop, it bowed. She walked into his world not as a guest, but as destiny itself. Her eyes met his, and in that single moment, silence became louder than any symphony he had ever known. He had been surrounded all his life by admiration, by noise, by words spoken for duty. But she was peace. She was stillness in a kingdom that never slept. And from that day on, his heart began to write stories even his mind couldn't translate. He loved her the way poets love the pause between lines, quietly, reverently, as though the act of loving her was worship. He never needed to speak it, she could feel it in the way he looked at her, as if the entire world had faded and she was the only truth left. His love did not crave attention. It sought no witness. Yet somehow, the world knew. His poems changed. His eyes softened. His voice carried a depth it never had before. The people called it art, but it was love in disguise, Fazza's silent promise, woven into every word. At night, when Dubai slept beneath the glow of its own brilliance, he stayed awake, writing by moonlight. He wrote of skies that remembered, of winds that carried her name, of deserts that waited endlessly for her return. To those who read him, it was poetry. But to him, it was confession. He poured everything he couldn't say into ink, letting his pen become the bridge between what he felt and what he feared to reveal. In every verse, she lived, not as an image, but as an essence. There were moments when he almost spoke. When the weight of silence pressed too hard, and his soul yearned to let her know how deeply she had changed him. But he stopped every time. Because he knew, some love stories are not meant to be spoken, they are meant to be felt. He chose silence not out of fear, but out of devotion. Words could have diminished what was divine between them. His silence became a sanctuary, and his poetry became her reflection. The world watched him, admired him, adored his words, but none could see the truth behind them. Every award, every performance, every verse that made millions weep was a letter to her soul. She might never have read him the way he intended, but he didn't mind. Love, for him, was not about being known, it was about being true. His heart had already spoken louder than any declaration could. The world might have heard his poetry, but she was the one who heard his heart. Sometimes, in the stillness of dawn, he would whisper her name into the wind. It wasn't a plea or a wish, it was gratitude. He thanked the heavens for allowing him to feel something so eternal. For giving him a love that did not need to be his to belong to him. She had become his prayer, and every sunrise was her answer. In his silence, he found faith, not in miracles, but in meaning. She was his meaning. She, too, felt it, the quiet pulse that seemed to follow her everywhere. Though he never confessed, his presence spoke. The way his eyes lingered, the way his words touched without naming, the way his energy found her even in crowded rooms. She had read his verses and recognized herself in every line. He had promised her forever without saying a word. And she, in her own silence, had accepted. Their hearts had spoken a language no one else could hear. There were days when distance separated them, when life pulled them to different destinies. Yet the bond never broke. It stretched across time and space like an invisible thread, unseen, but unbreakable. His poetry continued to bloom, each piece carrying a trace of her, her laughter in his metaphors, her presence in his pauses. Even when he wrote of pain, it was her love that softened it. Even when he wrote of loss, it was her memory that made it beautiful.
In one of his rarest poems, hidden deep in his private journals, he wrote, "If silence had a sound, it would speak her name. If forever had a face, it would look like hers." Those were the words that summed up his life, a promise wrapped in quiet reverence. He never gave that poem to the world. Some things were too precious, too intimate, too sacred for eyes that did not understand. It remained between him, his heart, and the heavens. Years later, when his name had become legend and his words were carved into the history of literature, people still spoke of that era, the age of Fazza's soft-spoken passion. They wondered who she was, the muse behind the magic, the silence behind the sound. But perhaps that mystery was part of the promise. For true love, when divine, never needs proof, it only needs presence. And so, the story endures, of a man who could rule a world, yet chose to kneel before love. A prince who hid his forever inside verses. A poet whose silence spoke louder than all his words combined. He loved her quietly, but the world hurt his heart, not because he shouted it, but because love that pure cannot be silenced. It lives, it breathes, it echoes, even when the poet is gone, even when the pen runs dry. She had always felt his presence, not through touch, but through the delicate hum of destiny that lived between their worlds. When the nights grew heavy and the stars seemed to linger longer than usual, she could feel him in the air, in the rhythm of her heart, in the stillness that followed her thoughts. Though he had never spoken the words, she had learned to hear them in his silence. It wasn't absence she felt, it was the kind of nearness that defied logic, the kind that the universe reserves only for souls that once shared the same beginning. His love had never needed to reach her lips, it had already found her soul. She would read his poetry beneath the glow of her lamp, the golden light kissing the pages like a secret the world could not touch. Each line carried a piece of him, a sigh, a heartbeat, a hidden prayer. Sometimes she would pause midway through a stanza, close her eyes, and imagine his hand moving across paper, his thoughts trembling between ink and eternity. The world called him a poet, but to her, he was a storm disguised as peace, a man who could make silence sing.